Prosecution. This is the second panel, Human Trafficking, Global Solutions to, or Legal Solutions to a Global Problem. We can welcome the panelists down to the front. My name is Chelsea Edwards, and this is my co-panelist, Whitney Vietz. We would like to welcome you to the panel. Before we begin, we just want to give some instructions. We'd like to call your attention to some note cards that are floating around, and then also some people that are handing out note cards. After this moderated discussion, we'll be taking questions from the audience, but rather than passing around a microphone, we ask that as you think of a question during the presentation, you can write your question or questions on one of those note cards and hold it up so that one of our volunteers can collect it. So if you need a note card, you can raise your hand, one of the volunteers will bring you one, and feel free to write questions and hold them up to be collected throughout the program. You don't have to wait until the end, so we'll just collect those and then read them to the audience, or to the panelists. In addition, I know that we are the only panel between you and lunch, so don't worry, Whitney will explain how lunch works at the end. I know everyone is anxious for that as well. So human trafficking has sort of become a media buzzword, and ironically, a trendy thing to care about, but from a distance. And yet myths and misconceptions about the issue abound, and the attention paid to the issue sort of in the abstract has not changed the fact that over 20 million people globally are victims of trafficking, and that's according to a Department of Homeland Security estimate, ILO estimates, and from other organizations. Several U.S. circuit courts have recently called trafficking in persons a contemporary manifestation of slavery, one of the most severe abuses that women face around the globe, and a pandemic that disproportionately affects women and girls. The imbalanced power dynamics that open the door to such a system of oppression go beyond just male versus female, but we must confront the truth that this issue is inextricably linked to women's rights, and therefore crucial to a defense of human rights. So this panel will define and provide a legal context to human trafficking, confront myths and misconceptions, and examine why trafficking has had such an impact on women. We hope that this panel will serve as a platform for discussing diverse ways that lawyers and others can use international and domestic law to prevent systems of oppression against women, confront trafficking offenders, and bring healing to survivors of such abuse. This is clearly no small task, but we are honored to have three experienced and venerable panelists to join us for the conversation this morning. So I'll briefly introduce them, and then I'll hand it over to Whitney to moderate the discussion. So to my immediate right, we have Ms. Kimberly Benson, all the way from Memphis, Tennessee. Ms. Benson is the founder of A Bridge of Hope Ministries, which provides direct services to victims of trafficking, trains law enforcement and civic groups, and advocates for women on the local and state level. Her work is inspired by her own experience as a survivor, and we are humbled that she's here to share more about that with us this morning. To her right is seated Ms. Hilary Axam, the director of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She's prosecuted cases with the DOJ involving sex trafficking, compelled farm and factory labor, domestic servitude, and forced labor in restaurants and bars. Ms. Axam has also provided training to domestic and international actors on the issue, and she's a Penn alum, so we're very happy to welcome her back. And finally, at the end, we have Ms. Dana Sussman, a staff attorney with the Anti-Trafficking program at Safe Horizon in New York City. There she represents trafficking victims in civil litigation, immigration relief, and criminal justice advocacy. She recently represented a woman who was trafficked to New York for domestic servitude and exploited by her employer. That employer happened to be the Indian Deputy Consul General, which, as you may recall, resulted in great political tensions between the US and India this past December. But we're excited to give her the opportunity to talk about the important issues that were overshadowed by that media hype, which are the rights of the worker and the all too common exploitation of similarly vulnerable women. So thank you so much for joining us. I'll now turn it over to Whitney, and please feel free to write questions as you think of them.
Thank you, Chelsea, and good morning, everyone. As Chelsea indicated, we're thrilled and very lucky to have panelists who I think have a very diverse range of experiences and knowledge. So I just want to begin the panel by actually asking each panelist to briefly provide a foundation for the problem of human trafficking and the main issues surrounding it from her own perspective. So Ms. Benson, I'll actually invite you to begin, and if you could start us off by sharing kind of how you became involved in this issue and the reality faced by the victims that you serve.
I was a survivor of trafficking at the age of 18 by a woman friend of mine, and that pretty much breaks the stereotype as what it is and what it looks like. I didn't know there was a problem. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what that involved. And it wasn't until an advocate actually listened to my story that says, "You don't realize, do you?" And I did not even know that what I had went through had a name. Well, I got to the point where most women, I'm not male bashing, but we women get sick and tired of being sick and tired, so I dusted my bum off and hit the road and hit the pavement. And it's been an uphill, but a joyous ride the whole way, because we've actually seen a lot of slaves being set free just because one found her voice.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you all for taking the day to focus on these issues. So I head up the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. We were founded in 2007 to focus exclusively on combating human trafficking by prosecuting human traffickers. And we grew out of years of work in the Civil Rights Division of combating involuntary servitude and slavery under the 13th Amendment, which are badges and incidents of historical chattel slavery in the United States. And in 2000, the law was greatly expanded with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act to reach more modern manifestations of slavery, including really significantly nonviolent forms of coercion that Congress recognized can be every bit as powerful as violent coercion, particularly with all the themes we've been talking about in a society where there are profound imbalances of power. It's a crime of powerful people knowing how to oppress and exploit powerless people. Now, it doesn't have to be gender-based, but it very often is, because women experience so many power imbalances, whether it's because of gender-based violence, sexual violence, whether it's because of poverty and gaps in education and opportunity. All of those vulnerabilities converge to make women and girls disproportionately targets of human traffickers. So we talk in terms of international anti-trafficking conventions, in terms of the 3 Ps of protection for victims, prevention of trafficking crimes, and prosecution of traffickers. My piece is nominally the prosecution piece, but I spend a lot of time on the soapbox about how those 3 Ps are not as separate as people like to think. And in our view, prosecuting traffickers is inextricably intertwined with preventing trafficking and protecting victims, because we've worked with many victims and survivors who don't fully feel safe until their trafficker is behind bars. And there's a tremendous shift in that balance of power when the one-time victim walks out free and empowered for having spoken out and been believed, and the one-time trafficker goes back with the U.S. Marshals to spend sometimes the rest of their life behind bars. And that is just a powerful testament when we as a country bring the laws of the United States and the laws of the government down on the side of the person who was vulnerable and powerless, and we restore the rights and dignity of that person and punish the conduct that allowed that exploitation to occur. So we do these prosecutions all over the country. We work with U.S. attorneys' offices, federal law enforcement, federal prosecutors, and we come in as the kind of specialized expertise just on human trafficking crimes. And the particular challenges of working with victims and survivors of human trafficking. In the course of doing that, we work extremely closely with survivor advocates, victim advocates, and we really are striving to make the whole response to human trafficking much more trauma-informed and victim-centered, and we'll talk a lot about how we do that. But it's, on one level, it looks like my role has so little to do with the gender dynamics we were talking about, because we operate in terms of immigration laws and criminal laws and transnational organized crime conventions and things like that. But on another level, at the core of all of our work is analyzing notions of power dynamics, the line between coercion and consent, and the difference between acquiescence and consent, and all of those themes that we were talking about throughout the morning. So I'm really excited to bring our human trafficking work into this dialogue about gender dynamics and gender exploitation.
I want to thank Chelsea and Whitney for inviting me to join this panel. I feel honored to be here with you both, and to all the Toll Scholars for organizing such a great event. I come to this work from a workers' rights and labor rights lens. It happens to be my background, and I see we sort of see a divide sometimes in this movement between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but it is all work, and it is work that is forced without consent, and we'll talk about those different types of consent that the law recognizes. I work at an NGO in New York called Safe Horizon. The anti-trafficking program at Safe Horizon was started right after the federal law was passed, and was one of the first grantees of federal money to do this work. we come at the work from a comprehensive model. So I'm lucky enough to be at an organization that has social services and legal services all in under one roof, in addition to policy, advocacy, and training. So I work very closely with our case management team that allows me to do the legal work. Without them, I couldn't do the legal work, and that involves emergency shelter, healthcare issues, education, housing. Sorry, I said housing already. Various types of social services needs that the client will need met likely before they'll be able to work with an attorney on some of the longer term issues. We work through a client-centered approach, which can sometimes be difficult, but what that really means is that we instill choice back into our clients' lives. So often, choice and decision-making has been taken away from our clients, and so we are there to provide them with an array of options and allow them to take the kind of time they need to determine what will be best for them. So our clients set the pace, and we are there to facilitate those decisions. Again, it can be quite challenging. The law restricts us from doing certain things or from certain requirements we have to do, but we really do try to keep the client at the center of all of the work that we do. In addition, Safe Horizon has recently started Voices of Hope, which is a survivor-led advocacy group. We are informed by their recommendations of how we can do our jobs better. And I think that as this movement is relatively young, it's, in the long scheme of things, it's still relatively young, but we're at a point now, I think, at least at organizations like mine, where our clients that we've worked with for many years are now becoming advocates in their own right, and we can do our jobs better through working with them and learning from them. So I look forward to talking more about some of those issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, Ms. Benson, you gave an especially brief talk, so I just want to redirect to you quickly. I know you work a lot with victims on the ground. If you could speak about some of the realities that they encounter and how you handle the challenges that they face every day in your work.
The biggest hurdle that they face is the misconceptions. They're out there because they want to, they're asked for it, they only come from that side of the tracks, they're uneducated, and there's so much stereotyping, especially about women. And within the movement, so many people think it's all women that are involved, and that's another misconception. But the biggest hurdle that we're seeing is them not even knowing, one, their worth, and two, that they have rights. Because for so long, women are influenced by what they hear, men are stimulated by what they see. Thus, men drive the demand for human trafficking, but women really believe the lies that they're told, and they believe it wholeheartedly. And when you have somebody who doesn't believe in themselves and they don't believe that they have power, that becomes their greatest hurdle. So it's just like getting somebody clean and sober off of drugs. Once they're clean and sober, you then have to go back and help the therapeutic model and get them to realize their self-value and worth. And that becomes the greatest hurdle that we're finding right now.
And then just to follow up on that, you spoke a bit to us prior to the symposium about some of the laws in Tennessee that affect this issue, and maybe I was hoping maybe you could speak more about that and how state governments can actually help to combat trafficking on a local level.
Tennessee has now some of the strongest laws in the United States. After this spring session, this will actually make Tennessee the strongest legislatively. Now that puts a lot of more challenge to us as advocates and those working actually in the trenches, because now you actually have to train people on what the laws are. Laws are great, however, they have to trickle down. And so you have a lot of misconceptions. We are also training law enforcement throughout the state, and they don't realize that trafficking happens in Tennessee. That happens, in Cambodia, it happens in India, it happens in Indonesia, it happens everywhere but Tennessee. I don't know if you know that. It doesn't happen in Tennessee. So, but what has happened is we actually have a really great group that are working on both sides, both conservatives and liberals, both in the House and in the Senate, that are extremely passionate about stopping the violence against women. And so they've actually taken on human trafficking as the I hate to say the core project, but this is one of the major projects that they're taking on in the state of Tennessee, and they're vowing, both men and women, both sides of the aisle are actually working together finally in harmony to combat this problem, especially in the state. And it's actually setting state precedents, because we actually have, we were talking last night about it, we actually have a prosecutor in the state of Tennessee in Nashville that actually has made that her passion, and now she's making models about a John school and trying to help people really work with vacating conviction laws. We have new laws now that are on the books. There's two really great ones. For those of you who are advocates, if somebody comes to you and they're 18, they're already considered an adult by law. And so if it was found that they were trafficked as children or abused as children, typically the law, as I understand, I am not a lawyer, okay? As we've seen it, they don't go back and prosecute for the things that have happened in the past. So what they're doing now is they're actually saying anyone from the ages of 18 to 28, now that if it's found that you were trafficked as a child or violence besought you as a child, that now we can actually charge your perpetrator for child crimes. And that is really big, especially in the advocacy world, because most of the time when we get them, they've been in the life or in the game for so long. And so if you do it as an adult, they're not going to get as much time, but people are a lot more sensitive to crimes against children, which has actually been a really great segue. The other one is not only the vacating convictions, but we actually have a restitution law that actually helps to give restitution back to the victims. Your problem with that, and where we're really trying to strengthen, part of what Tennessee's gone through is they've implemented new laws. They try them out for a while, and then we come back and sit down at the table to see, are they working? Should they be strengthened? Should they be reworded? One of them is the asset forfeiture law, which is actually pretty cool. And what they do is any trafficker, and trafficker for the state is not just the person who pimped somebody out, and that's a big misconception too, because there are facilitators and other people involved in trafficking. But anybody that's arrested for trafficking, all of their assets can be seized and the money given back to the victims. Now, what makes this hard is because most traffickers don't own anything. They put everything in cash or they have it in somebody else's name. However, they're actually looking to strengthen those laws, and those are actually really good, because when you have a victim who's not trained in anything other than sexual servitude, and that's not all human trafficking is, but when you get somebody who's only know sexual servitude as an occupation, this money helps to set them up to go back to school, to help them get better education and higher employability skills. And sometimes one of the things we train is getting employability skills in male-dominated fields, so that they don't have to just be the cooks, the nurses, the secretaries. You can do everything. So that's part of what the laws that are being strengthened in Tennessee are actually doing. So they're actually quite good.
That's fantastic. I think just on a related note, I want to direct this to Ms. Axam. Kind of on the federal level, what the laws look like and how that's kind of influenced your ability to prosecute. And just a note, while I'm directing these questions to specific panelists, if other panelists have comments, please feel free to add something.
Well, thank you for indulging my inner law geek that often doesn't get to come out, but I will talk statutes for just a few minutes. So the federal anti-trafficking statutes are Title 18, Chapter 77, and I like to think of that chapter, it's sections 1581 through 1597, as like a toolkit. There are many different statutes, each directed at different manifestations of the trafficking problem. So there's a labor trafficking specific statute, there's a sex trafficking specific statute, and then there are other variants of parts of labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, in terms of recruiting into servitude or holding somebody's identification documents to further one of those crimes. Most things are derivative or related to those flagship crimes of labor trafficking under Section 1589, sex trafficking under Section 1591. What's interesting, though, is that at the core of all the Chapter 77 crimes is this notion of coercion. And that's what is the huge innovation of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It defines coercion as a scheme, plan, or pattern intended to make a reasonable person fear that serious harm will result. And this was in the background and in the legislative history in 2000 that you look at the perspective of a reasonable person in the victim's situation. And that was then in 2008 with the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act written right into the statute. that you're to look at the victim's vulnerabilities and to analyze the scheme of coercion from the perspective of a reasonable person in that situation. So the question is not whether the judge who's adjudicating the case would feel free to walk out the door. It is whether a person who has that victim's background of sexual violence, that victim's lack of education, lack of language skills, lack of immigration documents, would that person feel safe walking out the door? So you look at all these common defenses to trafficking crimes. Did the victim have an opportunity to escape, quote unquote, in the sense that she was not physically restrained, in the sense that there was no lock and key? Did the victim have an opportunity to outcry, quote unquote, in the sense that there was a telephone sitting right there? Now, those are opportunities from the perspective of a person with a lot more power and a lot more options than the victim. So in this sense, in some ways, I feel like the development of anti-trafficking law is building upon and following the evolution of the law in terms of sexual violence and the notions of consent. And in other ways, it's kind of leading it. Because I'm not aware of anywhere else in the law that just writes into a statute that you look at the surrounding facts from the perspective of the victim and her vulnerabilities. And I'll give you a really powerful example. We just finished getting this case sentenced, and we convicted it last November. United States versus Fields was a case in Tampa, Florida, where the defendant preyed on young women and girls who were already prostituting and already using drugs. And there was a long time where we as federal law enforcement would look at a case like that and say, we're not going to be able to prove coercion. We're not going to be able to prove that this person was compelled through threats or through other means of psychological coercion to perform the act of prostitution. How can we prove that she didn't, quote unquote, do it consensually, since she had previously done it consensually? And this is where we have to push these notions of consent. Saying that a person consented to an act of prostitution in a different time, at a different place, and under different circumstances is completely different than saying she thereafter consented to every act of prostitution, wherever, whenever, and under whatever circumstances. And we're often able to show the completely different and more oppressive circumstances of the commercial sexual activity under the defendant's control than under a greater level of autonomy. I won't say under the victim's control, because it's rarely under her control, but there is certainly a spectrum of levels of autonomy, levels of dignity, being able to not work on a day where you feel terrible, where you have a horrible headache, being able to keep the money, keep the proceeds of your own toil. I mean, that's an obvious indicator of how much control you have over your existence. So, there was a time where these cases would have been declined because we can't prove coercion due to the victim's history of prostitution. But we really took a bold step forward in this Fields trial because the defendant preyed on the history of commercial sexual activity and the history of drug use among the victims as a vulnerability. And the judge came out and really powerfully said that to the defendant at sentencing. She said, Mr. Fields, you keep saying that these women were already prostituting and already using drugs as if that's some kind of defense. That makes it worse. You were kicking them when they were down. You were preying on them because of that. His scheme to control them was manipulating their access to addictive drugs. And he was literally a master at upping their drug dependency, manipulating a fake debt ledger where he inflated the prices and said they owed him, and making sure that the only way they could pay him back, quote unquote, was by performing acts of prostitution, giving him all the money. And what was just particularly striking in this case is he went on the message boards, the Craigslist, Backpage, Night Moves, the thousands of different message boards where people advertise commercial sex. He posed as a customer, and he contacted these girls, promising them a safe way home and back. He found girls for whom safety was an issue. And in fact, the 5 victims who testified so courageously at trial, almost every single one of them had a history where nothing had ever been safe in her life. A history of sexual violence and physical violence at the hands of relatives and acquaintances. And so his promising them safety was his preying on their vulnerability. And it was a very gender-specific form of vulnerability in terms of fear of physical and sexual violence. And he preyed on that, and it was just a great step forward where the judge was able to recognize that as preying on a vulnerability and not treat the fact that they were in prostitution and using drugs as some kind of indicator that they had consented to this treatment in which they have no control over which customers they serve. They get no control over the earnings. 100% goes back to him, and they're just completely helpless at his hands. So you contrast that to a few years ago where we had to very vigorously litigate, whether it was grounds to dismiss our charge of sex trafficking by force, fraud, coercion, where a victim had a history of having prostituted years ago in Guatemala before being lured to the United States on false pretenses and then forced by violence into prostitution. We look at that, and I think today I'm feeling like an optimist, and I see an evolution in the right direction of courts really recognizing the power dynamics behind that. And I just want to add that it's exactly the same for labor trafficking victims. We see people with very few opportunities. They're lured on false promises, and it's our job to tell their story from a perspective that captures the imbalances of power, the lack of options, and that prevents the law from saying, well, you could have walked out the door. There are reasons psychologically and in the background and the poverty and the immigration issues that the trafficker knows the person doesn't have options and is intentionally exploiting that. So that's really our challenge, is to take those statutes, those definitions of coercion, threats of serious harm, and to convey that to judges and juries in terms that account for the power imbalances.
And I would just like to add a couple things. Kim had mentioned the importance of restitution for our clients. The federal law, it has a fantastic restitution provision that talks about the value of the victim's services, so that when our clients who are sex trafficking survivors are not going to be given $7.25 an hour for 40 hours of work for the sex work they were forced to do, which sounds a little ridiculous. But we actually, as advocates, will calculate how much money their trafficker earned through their work, and we'll present that to the prosecutors, to present it to the judge, which is incredibly effective. Otherwise, in labor trafficking cases, it would be normally, it could be wages promised or sort of the regular Fair Labor Standards under the Fair Labor Standards Act. In addition, the federal trafficking law created a civil right of action in 2003, which has also been a really powerful tool for advocates. In an era where we see, the rights of employees sort of, the courtroom doors are closing for a lot of types of claims along discrimination and class actions for employees. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act has really opened the doors to a whole new class of workers, so that they can vindicate their rights in court. And I work with pro bono law firms on cases across the country in which we bring civil claims against traffickers, mostly in the labor context. But our hope is that we will be bringing cases on behalf of survivors of sex trafficking as well, because we do have that great provision, the restitution provision could inform civil relief as well. What I found in the civil cases is, generally it's not something I recommend to people to walk into court and file a lawsuit. It's could be years. It could open yourself up to challenges to your credibility. It's a lot on someone's shoulders. But what I've seen through working with survivors in civil litigation is it is an incredibly empowering experience when it is done well. And for our clients who walk into these law firms with a team of 5 lawyers working for them and taking their direction from them, it has been a really powerful and transformative experience for our clients. And the end result, ideally, is a really good settlement or judgment that can be enforced, so that our clients can perhaps travel home for the first time in 10 years, go to school, get their first apartment. So the civil remedy in combination with the criminal restitution provision have been really powerful tools for us to help our clients. I also wanted to mention, Hilary did a really great explanation of sort of the nonviolent psychological coercion that we see. And that is, in my work, I work primarily with labor trafficking victims. And in New York City, the majority of those victims are domestic workers, and the majority of those domestic workers are women. So that's sort of the gendered lens that I come at this work with. They are living in homes, their employers' homes. They are essentially hidden in the home. They may not be locked in rooms, but I just met with a woman yesterday who lived in a house in the suburbs for 4 years and never knew what town she was in. How could she have left? There was no subway, I live in New York, so it's the subway, but there's no public transportation, there's no one who spoke her language. She had a key to the house at one point, but it was taken away, so even if she left, she wouldn't be able to get back in, and the traffickers would certainly know that she had attempted to leave. She never left the house without the traffickers for over 4 years, so she would be dropped off to do an errand and picked up at a certain time, and she had to be there, but she had no way of communicating and no way of knowing where she was, other than she knew, where there was like a market and a laundromat, and that was about all she knew. But again, no physical violence, no explicit threats, but she had linguistic isolation, cultural isolation, geographic isolation, and if you look at sort of the cumulative effect of what that can do to someone, in addition to the fact that she was working 7 days a week and 14 hours a day for 4 years, we're lucky we have a law that recognizes that, and the great work that the prosecutors have been doing to educate judges on this has also allowed us in the civil context to educate judges on what this looks like. So I think that the law, it's an exciting area because the law is evolving. These new laws are being passed or being improved year after year, and so we have a lot of tools in our toolbox.
Thank you so much. I think Ms. Sussman and Ms. Benson, just to follow up on that, you've spoken a lot about what your organizations do specifically, but more generally, how do you think NGOs have responded to the problem of human trafficking across the United States, or perhaps specifically New York or Tennessee?
They're doing well. It's a progress. We've seen a lot of NGOs that kind of keep to themselves, and we find a lot of NGOs aren't working very well together because it's kind of territorial in the NGO world. But what we're finding, though, is they are actually part of bridging the gap of services. Where the law, especially like law enforcement, can only go so far with a client, the NGO can pick up the needs of. In Tennessee, the funding has been cut so bad that there's very little that the local law enforcement can do to a person that is rescued. So once they're rescued, they take their phone, they download all the information, they get all the data, but where are you going to put them? Well, where we are, there's only one safe house in the state, and they're on a 2.5-year waiting list. So you don't have case managers working in the police department, so they call NGOs to say, we need help finding lodging, we need help finding them a job, we need hygiene items, clothing, food, we need all kind of things. So NGOs are actually quite essential, in my opinion, being one, but we're actually quite essential because we actually bridge the gap where a certain boundary stops. And see, also one of the things that we embrace is we know our boundaries, so that's why we go to people like that are on the panel, because we are not Walmart. We are not your one-stop shop. We are good at what we do, but we also know that collaborating with other professionals is what's going to be the best interest of the client. And that has been the largest thing that we've seen, is NGOs really are bridging the gap in services that are needed where each of us have our boundaries.
Ms. Sussman, do you want to comment?
Sure, yeah. I would reiterate what Kim mentioned about collaboration. We collaborate very closely with Hilary's office and with other law enforcement agencies, both in the state and federally. We collaborate with other NGOs in New York. We're lucky to be in New York, where we have half a dozen excellent anti-trafficking organizations, and we've all sort of developed our own specialties, our own interests, or areas of expertise. So we're constantly consulting with one another. We also partner really closely with community-based organizations, and I think that's been a real key for us to do outreach to communities that we might not otherwise reach. We've partnered with a Filipina migrant workers organization in New York City that has been really instrumental in informing their members of their rights and spreading the word to their community. We've partnered with other, ethnic and nationality-based organizations in New York City. Again, we're lucky we're in New York City where those things exist, but we're able to make the connection to folks who might not, I've never had a client walk in the door and say, I am a victim of human trafficking. The idea that, has your passport been taken away? Have you been threatened? Have you been withheld pay? Have you been, made false promises? All those kinds of things, they're able to, when we work in collaboration, screen appropriately and then send folks our way when they might benefit from working with us. And I think that, we do have case managers and social workers on staff, which is fantastic, but when we don't have sort of the language capacity in-house, we have partners who we work with in the city who can help. So I think that we're all learning from each other and working very closely with law enforcement as well, and establishing those relationships is crucial. We have law enforcement partners that we trust, and they have NGO partners that they trust, I hope, and we're able to sort of do everything with the client's best interest in mind. So I think we're not doing this alone, and I think that's probably the most important thing.
I don't think we can do it alone.
Yeah, no, not well.
And just from the law enforcement perspective, when I train federal law enforcement, whether it's prosecutors or federal agents, and say that I have NGOs on my speed dial, and when I have an active case, I am talking to the victim advocate every single day. They look at me like I have horns and, green hair, and like I'm literally crazy and need to be. But until you've worked a case, you don't really understand, because as federal law enforcement, we're so trained that our job is to come up with evidence and get it admitted in federal court to prove the elements of the crime and get a conviction. Yes, exactly, that is our job. When it comes to human trafficking, and our burden of proof and our elements involve coercion and proving the victim's state of mind, we have to secure the trust of the victim to get her to confide. You cannot prove coercion without the cooperation of the person who was coerced, because you can't see coercion. It's not like the drugs that can be seized, in a sting and an undercover buy. You need that person to tell her story. And in order for her to tell her story, you have to empower her and treat her as an active participant and a partner in this law enforcement criminal justice process. And we need a victim advocate to do that, because it's not an appropriate role for us to be stabilizing and meeting the humanitarian needs of a traumatized person. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do it well. We need our partners to do that, so that we can then establish that rapport and get the story of the victim. And it's just a completely different experience for law enforcement to be operating in this space, but it is absolutely the key to getting these cases done. So collaboration is really everything for us.
Absolutely. And Ms. Axam, just to follow up with that, I'm aware, and I'm sure you are too, that some victims may be unwilling to come forward because they're afraid of being prosecuted for prostitution or immigration violations. How do you think kind of the government itself and the agencies within the government can be more responsive to the needs of the victims to kind of prevent that exclusion of people who may need assistance?
So there's two things going on there, equally significant. One is victims are afraid to come forward. You framed it as afraid to come forward because they might be prosecuted. They're afraid to come forward for a lot of reasons. It may be fear of prosecution. It may be fear of retaliation at the hands of the trafficker. The trafficker has often told them what will happen to them and their families if they tell anybody what happened. And they believe that because the trafficker has more experience in this country, more education, more power in general, and they are terribly afraid. Then there is the problem of a victim who has come forward because of something bad has happened, and is willing to seek help because things have gotten just that bad, that despite all the fears and all of the other psychological pressures, because there's often fear combined with loyalty to the trafficker. It's very much like the dynamics in domestic violence. It's a combination of fear and dependence, fear and loyalty, fear and love. This person may be cruel to them, but at the same time, this is the only person offering them shelter. And the trafficker may have made false promises, but this may be the only person who's ever made her promises of any kind. And I mean, I had this lightning bolt moment in one of the first cases I worked, and I'm talking to this victim about how she was recruited. This is a young Mexican girl who was recruited by the trafficker before being prostituted in Mexico, smuggled across the border, and then prostituted all over the United States. And I'm trying to think, how am I going to explain to a U.S. jury why this girl went with this guy that she really didn't know, and why she believed his promises that, oh, I'm going to marry you, I'm going to build this big house for you. So she's very young at the time, third grade education, living at a roadside taco stand because her family is so poor that they have to send her out of the village, down to where she can make a little money and bring it home to the family. When she sees them every couple of months, no one's going to notice she's missing. Guy picks his target really well. He lures her away with these gifts that we had, because she still had them with her when she was rescued, little teddy bear, little trinket jewelry, like gumball machine kind of jewelry. And she's saying this is what the guy offered her, and this is why she went with it. And I'm thinking, how am I going to convince the U.S. jury that this is what was going on? And then I think to ask her, like, you ever got a birthday present from anybody? No. You ever got a Christmas present from anybody? No. You ever get a present of any kind from anybody ever? No. So it's like, you look at it from her perspective, and this is the first guy who's ever showed a kindness to her, the first person anywhere in her life. And I had a victim who ran away from her trafficker once she realized he was prostituting her and abusing her, ran back home, whereupon she was beaten by her father and raped by her uncle. And then she decides, well, if I'm going to be beaten and raped anyway, I might as well go back to this trafficker who is promising to build me a house at the other end of all the beatings and rapes. It's that kind of situation you're dealing with, and you're trying to tell these stories to the jury. And, as law enforcement, you have to establish a kind of rapport. You cannot get these kinds of stories out of victims by sitting down and saying, okay, tell me whether you're a victim or not. They haven't even connected the dots necessarily. As you're talking to them, they are still believing that this person is going to build them a house. Therefore, you're saying, did anybody deceive you? Her answer is going to be no. It's not her job to connect the dots. It's our job to connect the dots. We are gathering information and letting her tell her story so that we can read those data points. We can read that story through the lens of the power dynamics and the manipulation and control. So you asked about failure to identify victims. Yes, they're afraid to come forward. They're afraid for many different reasons. So sometimes we never see them in the first place. But we work really hard on preventing those moments where they're sitting right across from us and we fail to identify them as victims because they're not able to connect the dots. They don't have the tools to do that because we haven't earned their trust. We haven't given them a reason to think that we have their best interests at heart more than the trafficker does, because he's had 3 years to explain why he has something to offer them and why he has, these promises he's going to deliver. We're strangers. So it would be a perfectly rational thing to cast her lot with, the known enemy versus the unknown enemy. How do we overcome that inherent resistance to just abandoning everything you've believed for years and casting your lot with a stranger? And I have been part of so many investigations where the whole law enforcement team, despite having this training, is ready to give up on that potential victim and say, okay, she's not a victim. I don't see anything. I don't see evidence of this. I don't see evidence of that. She hasn't related this. She hasn't related that. She's combative. She's uncooperative. Well, let's look at what she's been through and the kind of survival mechanisms that would result from that. And we can understand more why it's not going to happen the first time you meet her or the second or the third. Like, you have to earn your way into a dialogue with her. And so it's those opportunities where we do have people who have come forward, but we are failing them when we don't use our best expertise in trauma-informed and victim-centered interviewing and support and advocacy to get them to tell their stories. So victims can easily remain invisible by staying in the situation, by fleeing back to the situation, or by sitting right across from you and not opening up. And that's our real challenge, is to find victims that way.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So I have just one more question before we'll open it up to audience questions. I want to direct this at all the panelists in a slightly different gear. Ms. Benson, you mentioned that trafficking is not just a woman's issue, but I do want to ask, how do you think the issue of trafficking does affect women differently than it does men? And how is the solution to the problem, as all of you see it, tied to the issue of women's rights?
I think the biggest thing that, especially that we've seen and that I've experienced, is that women are, again, so stimulated by what they hear. So a good story is all a woman needs to go with her heart. And Miss Axam brought up a good point earlier when she was saying that the definition is to get somebody in their normal mind. But you have to understand, victims aren't in a normal mindset like you and I. They've been traumatized and they've been made to believe the worst. But it affects women so because women, not only do they believe what they hear, they wholeheartedly invest in what they hear. And so that's why they always link trafficking to domestic violence, and it actually has the same effects in PTSD and Stockholm syndrome. But the biggest parts that you see is the lack of belief within themselves, and that's huge. And the fact that they are believing what they hear, they believe that they are part of the problem, that no one's going to believe them, they're not worth anything, that they're going to arrest you too. The biggest thing we're seeing with the international, you will be deported, you have no rights here, you're not even human here. And the misconceptions that we're seeing are also plaguing the truth, because when people aren't educated, they make very ignorant assumptions about any said object in anything. But especially when it comes to women's rights, women need to understand how powerful they are and how their voice helps. When you're talking victim identification, and we see it a little bit differently, a lot of them, they don't recognize. We've never had anybody either who self-identified, I'm a victim. It actually takes that motivational interviewing to really assess the certain questions that you need to ask. And what we're finding, the biggest problem is not only do they not see themselves as victims, they see themselves as kind of less than human. When you got people who really believe the worst in themselves, that's really plaguing the problem. And when it comes to women's rights, we need to empower women that you're powerful beyond your belief, and you can use your voice and you can use your past as a catalyst to help launch you into your future. But you can't be bound by fear, and fear is probably the 99% reason why people don't come forward. It's a fear of everything they've heard and everything that they believe. And when you have teams of people that actually want to see the victim thrive, and you actually are, when you're talking victim-centered care, that's a huge thing, because what you're doing is you're empowering somebody who's been disempowered for so long. And when you've been disempowered, you can't even ask to go to the bathroom. Let me give you the example. If you remember the movie Shawshank Redemption, and Morgan Freeman got out on parole and he was working at the grocery store, he said, "Bathroom break, boss?" He said, "I have for so long never been able to go to the bathroom without asking for it." When you think about somebody who's been traumatized beyond just a prison setting with violence and the violence of the mind, because most of what these people go through is a mental torture, not as much physical. There's a lot of physical, but when you believe that your very life, your reason for existence will all cease if you don't produce said product, that becomes the crippling fear. And from what we've seen, that is what we have to do for anybody who's fighting for women's rights, is to get them to see their worth and their rights as human beings.
Ms. Axam, Ms. Sussman, did you want to comment on how trafficking affects women differently than men and how that's related to women's rights?
Well, I just think that all of the risk factors that make somebody vulnerable in the first place, and the lack of opportunity, the lack of education, the history of sexual violence that women disproportionately experience, make women disproportionately vulnerable to being trafficked by others. I will say something that was said on the earlier panel today really resonated about what makes women make decisions that buy into a misogynistic system. And I will say that we have plenty of women traffickers, and some of them who do some of the cruelest forms of coercion that we ever see. Whether it's in the domestic servitude context, it's often the female employer who is at the center of the abuse, whether it's verbal, physical, or whether it's in the sex trafficking context. There are females who work their way up in that scheme where the only currency is power and cruelty, essentially, to those less powerful. And we have women who are very violently exploiting other women or helping men do that, sometimes running it themselves. We had one sex trafficking case in Houston where one of the key members of the conspiracy was a female co-defendant who was providing the forced abortions at the direction of the male traffickers as a way to really exert the power over the female undocumented migrant women who were being exploited both for labor in these cantinas and bars and for sex. And there is that cruel dynamic there. But it is to the extent that gender really increases vulnerability and informs every power dynamic, it makes women disproportionately vulnerable to trafficking. And to adequately expose and respond to trafficking, we have to be profoundly aware of the gender dynamics when we're talking to victims. And it's amazing when I've worked with male victims of labor trafficking and you see the emotional impact of that feeling of helplessness, you can't help but think, like, somebody identified a vulnerability in this male victim and put them in that situation that women experience all the time, where they can't speak out and be believed, where they're so afraid that their decisions will have a bad consequence on others. So it does happen to men too, but with all of the gender imbalances in society, it just happens so disproportionately to women.
And I would only add that we see trafficking in female-dominated industries, and that primarily occurs in the informal economy. So domestic workers, home health aides, caretakers of all different stripes, office cleaning, home cleaning. So these are areas that have historically in the United States not been covered by the labor protections that are afforded to all other workers. So it's institutionalized even here. So the sort of lack of respect for that work and the gendered nature of that work play into this, I think, and it's really hard to sort of separate that out. I think part of the question was what we can do, or some positive note, and I will end with the positive note, and that is around domestic worker rights issues. There's been a lot of organizing on domestic worker rights across the country, and we work very closely with domestic worker rights organizations who have been instrumental in identifying trafficking victims in that industry. There's been domestic worker bills of rights passed in New York and California, and I believe Hawaii. They've gone through different houses in Illinois and a couple other states, I believe, where the domestic workers have been excluded from federal labor protections, and states are now adding them in under the state regime. It is, it overlaps especially in my work in New York, where we have a lot of diplomats and consular officials who have domestic workers in their homes, but also U.S. citizen employers who have domestic workers in their homes in our area. While it doesn't always mean that they're being trafficked, the increasing labor protections for domestic workers and all of the organizing around that has been a really bright spot in this work, and it's been domestic worker driven.
Thank you so much. So I just want to open it up for audience questions. I know that we have a number of note cards here, so I'll just grab those quickly. Okay. So this is directed at Ms. Axam. You mentioned the link between the 3 Ps. On the prevention issue, do things like John schools work? Do we need to shut down websites like Backpage.com, or will that drive the issue further underground? Who are the traffickers?
Very interesting questions and hotly debated questions at the policy level. Backpage is kind of a lightning rod because people see so much commercial sex activity on it, but there are hundreds and hundreds of websites, and actually some of the most pernicious conduct we're seeing is on the more underground message boards, to the extent that the internet is just a forum for communication, and an extremely anonymized one where there could be a server in Malaysia and then people in Mexico are communicating with people in Phoenix and New York and wherever else. It's a really difficult thing to get at advertising on the internet. It is just a form of communication, and it may increase the volume of communications, but it's not in itself driving the commercial sex market. People ask us all the time, when are you going to prosecute Backpage or Craigslist? To find a human being and prove that they have the mens rea, that they have the actual knowledge of any coercion behind the Commercial Sex Act or anybody being a minor in the Commercial Sex Act. And we don't really see so much online activity in the labor trafficking context, so that's why my remarks are really directed to sex trafficking. It's not something where the criminal law has a good solution, because you do need to prove the criminal defendant's knowledge and criminal intent. So I think, unfortunately, if you were to say, take down Backpage, take down Craigslist altogether, it's going to migrate somewhere else. I don't know what to do about that. Same way nobody's been able to clean up the track, where people used to have to go if you didn't have an online way to match up customers and people being offered for commercial sex. Now, in terms of John's School, I think I don't know whether it works. I honestly, from the federal perspective, we prosecute the cases involving force, fraud, and coercion to exploit people for labor or sex, and we really try to focus on the traffickers who, in my view, take over somebody's life and turn them into a slave and exploit them day in and day out. And some of these victims we've seen, it almost seems physically impossible if you didn't have the evidence there in terms of seized condoms and ledgers, but there are victims compelled to serve a customer every 15 minutes for 16 hours a day. A tremendous, cost to their physical safety, their health, and obviously their emotional well-being. It's just a tremendously burdensome and oppressive life, and that we try to get at those traffickers as perpetrators of modern-day slavery. Now, I do think that could be paired with going after the Johns, but if you want to draw an analogy to, say, drug enforcement, you have your kingpin and then you have your street corner drug user. So it would take, you would have to prosecute 50-something different customers who patronized that victim that day to get at that conduct versus the person who controlled her and offered her to all of those 50-something customers. So we're really focusing at the federal level on the people providing the victim and controlling her whole life. I do think that could be very effectively paired with state and local enforcement at the customer level, but we try not to lose sight of going after the really big players, because it is, in this day and age of limited resources, we can hardly keep up. As we've gotten better and better at case identification and finding more cases, we have to really go after the highest impact cases that are going to help the most victims and rescue the most victims and prevent the most new instances of trafficking. So I do think there's probably a place for prevention at the customer level. I just wouldn't want to see the higher level, higher impact ways of going after the traffickers, the coercers, the exploiters themselves, who are really the significant players in this, who make the customers' transactions possible.
If I can just add, there was a question about that John School, and I 100% agree about the federal level. We have seen on the local level that the John School, especially Davidson County, which is the Nashville of Tennessee, has worked very, very well. And I agree that it needs to be on a local level. I think the higher you go up, you need to be going up in the organization. And what you need to understand is human trafficking is not just a civil right, but it is organized crime. It is organized crime, if not better than the mafia used to do in the 20s and 30s. It is extremely organized. And so I 100% agree that as you go up in the levels, you need to go up with who you're getting. But the John School, especially in Davidson County, has been so intensive that it's got a 97% rate, because they have also worked it with vacating convictions on the first-time offender for a John, only the first one. And then they have to pay $800 to go to this school. And then that $800 actually goes to the Hannah Project, which actually aids victims. And the first 3 convictions for an adult woman over age 18 can go through these classes that are paid for by the John. Actually work. But I agree that keeping it on a local level helps to clean up the stuff on the local level, but you're 100% correct there.
So the second question actually will bring us to more of an international focus, which should be interesting. The question asker asks, are you working with international organizations to address the global aspect of trafficking?
Us?
Yeah, and please, it's directed at all 3 panelists.
We have partner organizations that do internationally, but we focus mainly on domestic, so I know you all do.
We work with an organization in New York called the Global Workers Justice Alliance. I think I got that right. And they do a lot of sort of portability of justice issues. So they've focused specifically in Mexico and Central America on developing local advocates who can facilitate cross-national litigation. So particularly for the migrant worker community, farm workers who are traveling back and forth so that they can maintain litigation in the United States. even if they have to or they're forced to return home. And so that comes up in the trafficking context, and the idea of sort of globalizing justice so that we can, on the most practical level, we can do video depositions, we can sort of work with local advocates to keep these cases going, because not everyone wants to stay. And I think that's also another misconception, is we do have immigration relief available, but not everyone wants to, they've come to this country and haven't been treated all that well and may want to return home. And that's a narrative that I don't think a lot of people hear. But the idea that you can return home but still maintain involvement in asserting your rights for the wrongs that occurred to you here is really important. So we have worked with NGOs on that level. And some of our partner organizations in New York have done a lot of work around, there's been a lot of sex trafficking cases out of a certain region in Mexico. So we've had partner organizations work on advocacy in that community, and also with the government on efforts to sort of, this is outside of my specialty, but extradite folks to the US to prosecute those cases.
And we work really intensively with Mexico. It is the single biggest source country of foreign victims of trafficking in the United States, which is very understandable given our shared border and all the commerce between U.S. and Mexico. And on these particular set of Mexican sex trafficking cases focused on one particular state in Mexico that Mexican authorities say is responsible for 90% of the sex traffickers in the country of Mexico. It also is, with shocking frequency, the source of the traffickers in U.S.-based trafficking prosecutions. And we've worked really intensively with our Mexican law enforcement counterparts and with Mexican NGOs to secure the extradition of traffickers from Mexico, as well as the rescue of victims who have been repatriated to Mexico, perhaps into the harm's way at the hands of the trafficker who has escaped from our prosecution or associates of that trafficker, and also to reunify trafficking victims with their children. It's a very common form of coercion in these networks to take control of the victim's child as a means of intimidating and, leverage collateral control. And we cannot get that victim to feel safe until her child is safe. And our partnership and collaboration with Mexican law enforcement NGOs is just critical to getting those children out of harm's way and back reunited with the trafficking victims.
Thank you. Our third question actually involves self-care for service providers. Of course, working with people who have been traumatized and through such horrible experience can cause a type of secondary trauma oftentimes to service providers. What strategies do you suggest to improve self-care for service providers in that regard?
I know the biggest problem we have is trying to find time to relax. You've got to take care of yourself anytime that you're dealing with victims, because reality, you're almost like somebody's toilet. They're dumping on you, and you have to understand that you've got to clean yourself up and rejuvenate yourself as well. And if you don't, then you're actually victimizing yourself. And because with care workers, and I include law enforcement, because you go home with your case. Your case is on your brain until it's over, and then even beyond that, you're literally going home with that person every day, and their burdens now become your burdens, because as a representative or an advocate, you actually have to know as much about their past and everything to be able to represent them well. And so then you're actually going through the abuse that they sustained via empathy. And I know that that's probably the largest thing I struggle with is just trying to find time away from all of that for myself, because you really do consume the person you're advocating for. You really do become that person, and their trauma now becomes your trauma.
This is a really timely question, because our program was forced. None of us would have signed up for this had we not been told we had to, for a vicarious trauma training. And attorneys don't like touchy-feely stuff. I hate it. And I had to spend 8 hours confronting my feelings, and it was really hard because I don't talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I want to do my job and serve the clients and work the cases, but it kind of left me feeling like, wow, I really do have vicarious trauma. Now, how do I deal with it? So it almost, to me, was unhelpful because it unearthed all of this stuff. And then they're like, take bubble baths or watch a movie. And I'm like, that's great, but not all that helpful. I think that I think the sort of the collaborative model that the movement has established is really helpful, because we can all sort of rely on each other when we need, when we need someone to talk to, or we need to sort of flesh things out with someone. I think we have to be really careful about how it affects our relationships. I think, we have obviously we can't share details of cases or anything, but we have family members or partners or friends who might be are the people that we rely on, and that might not be a fair position to put some of those people in time after time. But I think that I have to remember, and this is helpful for me, that I can't be everything to everyone. Our clients come to us with a lot of immediate needs, housing being the primary one, I think, across the board. Significant mental health needs, significant financial needs, and I can provide a very small sliver of that help, and I need to recognize the limits of what I can do. And that also it allows me to maintain my own sanity, but it also, I think, serves the client better. I'm not a social worker. I'm not trained in supportive counseling. If I attempt to go there, I don't feel like I'm doing the best thing for the client. And so that's always, and I tell our interns and our legal fellows and our more junior, attorneys and folks in this field, that you cannot be everything to everyone, and that is a really hard thing to deal with when you feel like there's so many needs that need to be met, and I need to help and do all of it. And the other thing is, part of that is empowering the client to start taking ownership over things. And we talk about a client-centered model. And when they become ready to start doing things on their own, they should be allowed to do things on their own and not be sort of, having their hand held through the whole process. So it is something that I don't really have all I have very few answers for, but it is definitely a concern. And I think particularly among lawyers who are not at all trained to sort of how to handle these things.
It's a huge issue in law enforcement too, to the extent that lawyers are bad with touchy-feely. Now take the subset of lawyers who are prosecutors and federal agents who are trained with their gun and their badge, and talking about being traumatized is not our strong suit. But it happens all the time. We have to really, once we get somebody who's an expert at this, and really we have to conserve those people as very valuable resources and ensure their longevity and make sure they don't burn out, because the victims need us. They need us to be strong. That means they need us to take care of ourselves. And sometimes we joke that we lost sight of what the appropriate level of emotional engagement is, because sometimes you do the gallows humor and you're like, oh yeah, another day, another victim who sustained X, Y, and Z, and you're like, oh my goodness, I've somehow developed a wall where I can casually throw out a fact like that. And then sometimes somebody casually asks you, so, what do you do for a living? And you spill out this horrible, gut-wrenching story, and then you look at them and they're like, okay, that's TMI, and you realize you're not modulating between the extreme emotional engagement you experience sometimes, and then the unhealthy emotional distance you put up sometimes, and it's very complicated. And I think as a whole, the entire anti-trafficking movement is so far behind in this. As law enforcement, as NGOs, we don't have a good system or recommended protocol for how to stay on top of this, and the need for it bubbles up sometimes, but we're really just often putting the victims first and staying in survival mode and stay strong for them. And then there are these moments where you let down your guard and you realize you have a lot of work to do to keep the service providers and the first responders strong. And I think we have a lot of room for growth there. I don't have any answers, but I do know that it's a need.
Yeah, I'm just a law student with a couple internships worth of experience, and I feel like I have secondary trauma, so thank you for those comments. So the final question that we have time for, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, is as lawyers and law students and people committed to social justice, what can we do personally to help combat human trafficking? And invite all of you to comment on that.
I'll let y'all go first.
That's always, I feel like we always get confronted with this question, and it's tough. I think, there is certainly a space for scholarship in this area. I was just taking a look at the journal that was issued, and there's a trafficking article in there that I was actually really excited to read. So I do think that while it's sort of you're sort of in the sort of siloed world of academia, there is a space for research and writing and sort of developing this area. The law was passed in 2000. We've had about 100 civil cases that have been brought since the civil remedy in 2003, so about 10 a year. And we all know the numbers of tens of thousands of trafficking victims. So there is, at least on the civil side, it's a very new area, and we welcome people to take a look at the law and see how we can do a better job. I would say, NGOs like mine love free legal help from interns. We are all we do have a bunch of NGOs in New York. We're all at capacity. We all have wait lists. I love mentoring students, and I think that the work that interns do and legal fellows do is essential. As sort of a citizen of the world, it's really, we get that question a lot of what can I do? That one's really tough. I think that in the labor, so we come from a perspective where we often see our clients as sort of the experts of their own life experience. So if there is someone who you feel may be in a dangerous situation, I personally, because that's not what I do, I'm not going to go out and rescue or attempt to rescue someone. But what I would recommend is if you see something that might look like labor exploitation or something else that concerns you, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline is a national hotline that actually has really fantastic data mining information. So if they get several calls from Good Samaritans concerned about a certain part of a city or a certain store or a certain massage parlor or whatever it may be, they will be able to sort of consolidate that information and give it to law enforcement. That's a capacity that we as a smaller NGO don't have, but that to me that hotline has been one of the greatest interventions in identifying victims and collaborating with law enforcement. But it is, I still wrestle with like what I can do just as a citizen if I see something problematic. But I think that's a good one to keep in your back pocket.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. If you have legal skills, if you want to lend them toward an immigration law center to get somebody stabilized who may be a battered immigrant woman who may be a victim of trafficking, the more people feel stabilized and not, afraid of being deported, the more ready they are to tell their story and possibly report the crime to help us then go after the trafficker. And civil representation, assist on pro bono civil representation, because often those cases, which can prove the trafficking by a preponderance rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, can really move the law forward in terms of recognizing a scheme of coercion. And finally, just as a citizen, I just want to emphasize, look for those things that don't look right. We've had trafficking cases start because somebody saw a woman shoveling snow with a clipboard. That just doesn't make any economic sense. If you're paying somebody even 50 cents an hour, you're going to buy them a shovel. We also had one started when somebody was clipping the lawn with little scissors instead of a proper tool. It bespeaks somebody with power trying to wear down the will and break the resistance of this person, and it speaks volumes in terms of saying, like, this person is worth nothing to me, their time is worth nothing to me, their comfort and safety and efficiency is worth nothing to me. It says, I own this person. So those little signs, if something doesn't look right, it may be a sign of human trafficking. Call the hotline. Don't try to rescue anybody yourself.
Our approach is different. The biggest thing that you can do is use your voice. We have a law that's going in, and most caregivers to children know that there's a mandatory reporting for child abuse. But make this your mandatory reporting. If you see something that doesn't look right and you say nothing, because we're in a society now where it's not my business, it's not my place to tell, that ain't got nothing to do with me, you are part of the problem. So if you want to see it stop, use your voice, use your power. You have everything within you. We always tell people, do not try to apprehend anyone. People that have money invested in something don't fight fair, and it's extremely dangerous. But if you can gather as much information, if you see a particular car or a particular house, call that 800 number. You don't even have to give your name. The 800 number, you all can write this down. 888, and it's written this way on purpose. 888-3737-888. You can use that to report a tip. You can call and ask questions. You can do all kinds of things within that hotline, and they are answered out of DC, the Polaris Project. But what's neat is they will, wherever, no matter where, no matter what time of day, male, female, child, adult, they will get somebody in that area the appropriate person. If it's somebody that is in a home, they're going to contact law enforcement to begin working on the extraction of that person. If it's somebody that's out and just needs services, they're going to contact an NGO in that geographical area. But the biggest thing you can do, especially now, is use the power of your voice. Use social media. Use social media the right way, the way it was intended, to actually send out correct information. Don't get happy and just send out anything, because misinformation hurts the movement. That's my professional opinion. So get with reputable organizations. Find out who your resources are in your area. Even if you just have a piece of paper that says these are people who can take care of abuse, trafficking, and domestic violence people that I may know of. And you don't even have to personally know. Just give somebody a number. But if you being an actual part of the solution actually reduces the amount of future victims. And one of the last things I'll say is, don't be judgmental, because it doesn't make sense in your head. Don't assume that they were stupid, they were uneducated. I would never do that, because I don't know, and I'm just going to take a poll just real quick. How many of you have ever been involved in any form of domestic violence where they were telling you you weren't worth nothing, they were whipping you upside the head? Come on, don't be scared. Okay, see, there's people who are going to tell truth. More people in here were but won't raise their hand. What you have to understand is, don't assume you would do something in that situation, because we all said, if I was with him, I would just leave. You don't know that. It's the power of the suggestion and what's happening in the mind. So my two thing is, get involved, do your part.
Perfect ending note, I think. So on that, I'm going to conclude the panel. I just want to extend a huge thanks to Kimberly, Benson, Hilary, Axam, and Dana Sussman for being here. I know you all are very busy and involved. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us in this discussion and this conversation. Just a couple of quick announcements.